This was a couple of years back. I'm a truck driver by trade, and I used to run a route that took me through the majestic Oregonian forests. If you've ever driven on those highways, you'll know how thick those woods get, almost like a wall of trees on both sides. Sometimes you'd lose the radio signal, and then it was just you, your 18-wheeler, and the silence. If you're thinking that's a recipe for isolation, you'd be dead right. But I loved it. Those lonely roads were a stark contrast to the crowded bustle of big cities. I'll get on with my story. So, there I was, cruising in my semi. As the miles wore on, the absence of the chatter on the radio oddly began to get to me. I didn't get that feeling often, but I figured it was a sign I needed to take a break. After hours of driving in the enveloping solitude, I decided to pull over at a designated rest stop. The place was nothing fancy, just a rundown picnic table and a weathered old map of the wilderness mounted on a rusting metal stand. But it was a godsend for my sore legs and back. That's the downside of being a truck driver. Besides being away from family, sitting all that time isn't good for your body. I always start to feel it in my lower back, so I take breaks as often as I can. I decided to take a quick walk down the path, just to stretch a little and get my legs and back in motion so I could continue my drive. I took a deep breath of that crisp, pine-scented air and started strolling along the narrow path. Little did I know what was in store for me. The tall canopy of trees provided a barrier to the outside world. There was a light drizzle starting to splash down through the leaves, but it wasn't bothersome. If anything, it only seemed to add to the mystique of the forest. I was hoping to see some birds or squirrels, but there was nothing. It was all quiet. I remember feeling like I was in the presence of something strange. I just couldn't put my finger on what. As I wandered further down the trail, I picked up this odd smell. It was musty, rank, and, well, pretty nauseating to be honest. But earthly odors aside, there was something else that bothered me. The woods held an unsettling silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. There was an eerie stillness that had crept in. It wasn't there when I had first stepped out of the truck. I knew that much. I moved off the path, into the dense foliage, thinking I'd probably get a few cool nature shots with my phone. Maybe not the best idea in an unfamiliar place, but I had so few opportunities to explore nature that I had to take advantage of it when I could. As I trudged deeper into the forest, the rain fell harder. In the distance, I thought I heard a strange noise, something I couldn't quite identify. It was some type of animal. It almost sounded like the howl of a monkey. Just as I was contemplating my next move, I saw a shadow move between two tall trees. It looked like a person had just walked past, but my truck was the only vehicle at the rest stop. There was no one else here. Before I could even comprehend what I was seeing, there was this loud thump, a dull, booming sound that seemed to vibrate through the trees. It was so loud that I felt it in the ground under my feet. The noise was so jarring, so sudden, that I instinctively jumped back, crashing into a low-hanging branch. My heart was racing in my chest, and I squinted through the thick curtain of rain, trying to get a better look at the cause of the noise. With trembling hands, I managed to point my flashlight toward the silhouette in the distance. The beam hit the figure, and I caught a glimpse of something I thought was only an urban legend. What I thought was a person walking past was in fact a beast, all covered in dark brown hair and walking upright like a man. For a moment, there was total silence, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat echo in your ears. Then, an ear-splitting yowl broke the stillness. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, and let me tell you, I had absolutely no intention of sticking around to see what was going to happen. As I backed away, my boot sunk into an indentation in the mud. Looking down, my eyes widened as I realized I'd stepped my foot into a massive footprint. It was the same shape and form of a barefoot human foot, but it was at least twice the size of my boot. I was pretty certain of what I had seen just a moment prior, but this footprint confirmed it. I wasn't crazy. My mind was racing, and suddenly, the crackle of my radio punctured the silence. I'd never been so relieved to hear the radio static. I swiftly turned around and sprinted back to the parking lot at the rest stop. I didn't relax until I reached my truck along the roadside and was safely inside the cab. The chatter of the radio host filled the silence, but I just couldn't shake that eerie feeling. As I resumed my journey, I left behind the footprint, the tangible proof of the night's encounter buried in the forest bed. But the memories traveled with me, every stretch of road a reminder of what lurked in the quiet corners of the world. Looking back now, part of me is relieved that my encounter with the creature didn't escalate further, but I kind of wish I had stayed just a moment longer. Did I miss out on a shot to come face to face with the legendary Sasquatch? I guess I'll never really know what was out there that day. Every time I roll through these remote landscapes now, I can't help but cast wary glances towards the trailing woods. There's a sense of trepidation, sure, but there's also a touch of the curious observer in me, still lurking somewhere, always wondering, always on the lookout. I'm no stranger to the backcountry. I've spent countless nights out under the stars, a backpack strapped across my shoulders as I traversed rugged trails and terrains. But there's something about Sedona that's a little different. There's a tangible pulse in those hills. It's something unexplainable. One particular autumn, I got tangled up in Sedona's enigmatic energies. I was struggling with the effects of a chronic illness, and I desperately needed a refocus. So, I decided to backpack across the sweeping vistas for about a week, hoping to rejuvenate myself both physically and mentally. The sun hadn't yet crested when I set out my first morning. I'd already packed all the necessities for the trip. I double-checked my tent stashed atop my gear, reassuring myself it was secure. As the sun began to rise, I embarked on the trail leading into the heart of the desert. For the first few days, the journey was just as breathtaking as I remembered. I'd walked this particular route before, but it had been quite a while. Still, it was one of my favorite places on Earth. The rock formations here were layered, like someone had painted them all sorts of shades of oranges, reds, pinks, and purples. Each day unfolded much like the one prior. I'd wake with the sunrise, spend the day along my route until just after noon, where I would set up my tarp for shade and take a long lunch break during the hottest part of the day. I would get back on the trail a couple hours before dusk and set up camp as twilight descended. The nights were quiet, permeated only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of the numerous nighttime critters. I felt more alive out there than I had in years. That evening, I made camp along the edge of an impressive canyon. It must have been about 4 days into the trip at that point. There was a strange quiet in the air. I felt odd there, but there was no reason for it. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary to my eyes. I went about setting up the camp anyway. But as the night pressed on, I could not deny the sense of unease that had been shadowing me since my arrival. I had this feeling, the kind you get when you know you're not alone. It was like there was a presence lurking in the shadows, but always just out of sight. That night, as I lay in my tent, restlessly flipping through a trail guide, a distant howl pierced the air. It sounded close, closer than any I'd heard in all my time in the wilderness. My heart pounded in my chest. The echo came from somewhere down in the canyon, and it wasn't the howl of a coyote or a wolf. It was something else. Something I had never heard before. It echoed longer, louder, in ways that made the hair stand on the back of my neck. Slowly, I stuck my head outside the tent, gripping my flashlight with white knuckles. Under the brisk moonlight, some 20 yards away, stood a wolf. Its unsettling appearance caught me off guard. It was too tall to be a wolf, but it had the outline of one. I could see 2 eyes reflecting back at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I didn't hear it come into camp, and an animal that size shouldn't have been so silent. Before I could comprehend what was happening, The creature shape-shifted. One moment, it was a wolf, and the next, it looked like a haggard old woman. The eyes, though, they were the same. She was staring right at me, and then suddenly, she was inside my mind, sifting through my thoughts, my fears. I stumbled back, trying to scream, but nothing came out. She pointed towards me, and a sharp pain erupted through my body. I clenched my teeth, gnawing on my lip until I could taste blood. When I looked back at her, she was gone, vanished as if she was never there. With adrenaline fading, the pain ceased and was replaced by a sense of warmth. I saw nothing changed visually, but I could sense a difference in my body. It felt as if I was empty and whole simultaneously. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I have in decades. I know this sounds unreal, but I felt like my sickness was gone. I sat there, taking in the surreal reality of last night's encounter. The creature didn't hurt me, but healed me instead. I continued on my trek with no other signs of the creature. In the following weeks, I underwent medical tests, each one returning with 0 signs of my illness. My doctors were flabbergasted. As I write this, it's been years, and I haven't felt the symptoms since, only living with the profound sense of gratitude and limitless curiosity about the supernatural world. Maybe these things aren't always evil entities as portrayed in our local legends. Perhaps just like humans, they have layers of complexities too. One of these things saved my life that night in Sedona, and for that, I am forever changed. I know it sounds impossible, but I felt like I had to tell my story. Not everything out there in the dark wants to hurt you. Sometimes, maybe not often, but sometimes they can be our friends. I'm writing to you from the rustic depths of the Ozark Mountains in my home state of Arkansas. The Ozarks have always been a favorite escape of mine. You've got wilderness, hiking trails, and waterfalls. It's the perfect place to get some solitude if you are looking for a little alone time in the woods. This is where my story unfolds. I was on a solo backpacking trip, and it led me somewhere I was not expecting. It was November. The skies were a hazy shade of wintry gray, and the air had a chill to it. I remember it was overcast that day, but the sun was doing its damnedest to peek through the clouds. I was rooting for it, hoping to get some warmth on my back as I hiked, but no luck. Late afternoon crept in unnoticed. One moment I had the world in full view, the next moment shadows began to fall. On a whim, I'd strayed off the beaten path. I thought I heard the sound of rushing water and was hoping to find a backcountry waterfall, but it didn't look like that was in the cards for me. I did, however, stumble upon an old, decrepit cabin in the middle of the woods. It was definitely in a state of decay, but the roof looked like it would keep out the rain that looked to be on its way. I decided to set up camp in the cabin that night. If it got stormy, I could always set my tent up inside. I remember this unsettling feeling I had. I felt like I didn't belong there, though it was obvious the cabin had been abandoned years ago. Maybe it was the cabin itself. The floorboards creaked underneath my boots like old bones. The air was stale and moldy inside from years of neglect and wood rot. I tried to shake it off and just be glad I wasn't braving the rainstorm in a tent that night. I fished out my flashlight and looked around the place. The ruins of a makeshift kitchen were to my left. There was an old, rusty wood stove that was left behind. I set up my sleeping pad and bag and then set to work on a quick dinner. Nothing fancy, just one of those dehydrated backpacking meals. The wind was picking up outside. It howled and moaned through the trees. There was an old, moth-eaten sofa on one wall of the cabin. I contemplated setting up my sleeping bag on it, but it looked in rough shape. I decided the floor was likely the better option. It was getting cold, but was well set up for the night. The storm was in full force outside. Everything suddenly got darker, it seemed like. Not much I could do about it, though, so I climbed in my sleeping bag and drifted off to sleep. I was awakened sometime later by the intensity of the quiet. It was an absolute silence, unlike the usual white noise of the forest night. The storm must have stopped. I couldn't hear anything outside, not even the raindrops dripping off the soaked cabin roof. My every sense was telling me I was no longer alone. I felt like I was trespassing. Outside the cabin, a loud thump boomed in the distance. Eyes wide open now, I fought the terror clasping my gut. I was absolutely petrified. Through the cabin's solitary window, I saw an ominous figure basked in shadows. It must have been 8 or 9 feet tall. At first, I thought it was a deer, but they don't get that big. A deep, sour, rancid stench floated in on the damp air. It was the smell of rotting flesh and death. I crept along the floor to the door of the cabin. There was a 2-inch gap between the door and the wall. I was too afraid to stand up and look out the window. I noticed the creature's legs first. They were elongated and hoofed like those of an elk. I could see parts of its body. The creature was emaciated. Its hip bones and ribs were protruding. It was like there was no muscle underneath. It had a few open wounds that were raw and bloody. Infection seemed to have set in. The meat was yellow and slimy. The sight of it was gut-wrenchingly gruesome. I was sure it was some horribly sick animal that was somehow surviving with a deadly infection. But then I saw its face, and I knew I was looking at something downright evil. Its head was a bone-white skull. No flesh, no hide, nothing. Just an open deer skull. The flesh started again around the neck region, but its entire face had been skinned clean. It had no eyes, no nose, but it was smelling the air around the cabin. With a silent prayer to anyone listening, I forced myself to stay put, not daring to move a muscle. I hoped to God that I would go unnoticed. It was the longest night of my life. As the first light of dawn pierced the darkness, the demon creature faded with the retreating darkness. Soon enough, the clearing was empty, and I let out a sigh of relief. I didn't leave the cabin until the sun was high in the sky, and I was certain the creature was gone. I cut my trip short and headed back to the safety of human civilization. I had no doubt in my mind why that cabin was abandoned. What I didn't know was if the previous tenants had the sense to leave or if that beast did something to them. If anyone else out there has any experience with these things, I'd like to hear them, because I haven't been able to put my mind at ease since that trip. I wonder if the creature was as dangerous as it looked or if it was simply minding its own business. I can't imagine anything looking that horrifying to be anything but evil, but then again, I've been wrong before. I was out in the arid Nevada desert, drawn to some of the old gold mines that had been long abandoned. It was a bit of a hobby for me, searching for ghost towns and old mines. It was like a modern-day treasure hunt. I'd feel just like a kid again when I'd be out there exploring. Sometimes they can be hard to find, but this one was right out in the open. It jutted straight out of the desert rock like a foreboding monolith. It was pretty far from any modern civilization, though. There were remnants of the old town a few miles back, but as far as roadways and buildings with electricity, there weren't any. I didn't mind, though. It all added to the adventure. Carefully, I fitted my headlamp and stepped onto the threshold of the mine. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of undisturbed earth. Exploring these places always had an air of danger. These old mine shafts weren't exactly known for their stability. If I'm honest, it was a pretty poor idea for me to go alone, but I didn't have any good friends that shared my sense of adventure. So, there I was, all by my lonesome. The temperature in the mine dropped as I ventured further inwards. I took my time, shining my lamp over the time-worn cracks and crevices. I was on the lookout for any signs of instability or potential collapse. I thought about all the men who used to work in this place so many years ago. I was standing in the exact spot they stood. Slightly deeper in, I noticed something that felt out of place. There were these strange abrasions on the walls of the mine, inconsistent with the standard pickaxe markings. They looked like claw marks. I know it doesn't make any sense, but that's what I saw. I've been down a lot of mines, and I had never seen anything like it before. I couldn't help but feel a sensation of unease wash over me. For a brief moment, I felt like I wasn't alone down there. I brushed off the feeling as the nerves of exploring a new place, so I pressed on. I was deep in the mine when I heard the sound of water rhythmically dripping onto stone. I followed the sound of the water until I reached an open chasm, and then, out of nowhere, I saw a flurry of activity in the tunnel up front, just beyond the reach of my lamp. There was something down here with me. I saw it dart past again. It was a pale blur against the black of the mine. It looked almost human, but it was crawling around like a goblin. It disappeared around a curve before I could properly register its presence. Was it a person who had gotten lost down here and become feral? Or maybe it was the trapped ghost of a miner. There were loads of fatal mining accidents back in the day. I wouldn't be half surprised if the place was haunted by ghosts. I'm not sure why, but I continued down the tunnel towards the location where the figure had disappeared. I guess my curiosity got me. Rounding the bend, I froze. I was confronted with a collection of discarded bones and what looked to be some type of nest. As I edged closer, I caught a glimpse of the creature. Up close now, it was chilling, far from the human casualty I had initially hoped for. It was a pale, hairless entity, its skin stretched taut over its skeletal physique. It had large black eyes, the type that nocturnal animals have to help them see in the dark. There was no nose that I could see, just an ominous, gaping mouth. It was entirely unlike anything I had seen before. It was in that moment of sick fascination that the beast noticed something amiss and swiveled its head towards me. I pressed myself into an alcove, slowing my breath and praying to whoever would listen. For a moment, we were locked in a tense standoff. The creature sniffed the air, searching for the intruder it had sensed. Its bones snapped and popped when it moved. It was still looking for me. I slid from my hiding spot and began my retreat. Each footfall, each breath seemed overtly loud in the quiet mine. I don't know how long I walked backwards, but it felt like a lifetime. Somehow, the creature never found my trail. I reached daylight, and I can tell you one thing for certain: I had never felt relief like that ever in my life. As I sat there, under the clear Nevada sky, I felt my adventurous spirit wane. The allure of unknown relics no longer held the same appeal for me, not now that I know that creature is out there. I did a bit of research when I returned home, and I found that my experience matched a description of a creature known as a crawler. They are a subterranean species, and from the sounds of it, I'm lucky to have escaped with my life. Now, I'll still go out and explore an abandoned ghost town from time to time, but you won't catch me near another old mine or a cave. I'm still not exactly sure what that creature was, but I'm not about to put myself anywhere where I might see it again. I had this crazy experience a while back. I'm still not sure what to make of it. It was a beautiful morning along the bank of the Mississippi River. I had been on the water since dawn broke. My granddad taught me to fish this river. He's long since passed, but I never lost my love of fishing. I was out there alone that morning. It was a weekday, and I decided to call in sick at work. It was just too nice a day, and life is short. I didn't have a fancy setup or anything. Just a rod, my old tackle box, and a container of night crawlers all tucked into my little rowboat. I cast my line in the water and waited. I watched the other boats pass by in the distance. There wasn't much going on. By midday, I had caught a few catfish and a couple of gar. Not the biggest haul I ever had, but still fairly decent. I was feeling good, but that feeling didn't last. I felt this weird sort of static electricity in the air that stood my hair on end. It was like the air was charged. I can't explain it, but I felt this sense of subtle anxiety, like something was just wrong, though I couldn't see anything directly out of place. Even the river seemed different, like it was disturbed. Shadows moved through the woods behind me, and there was a heavy rustling in the underbrush. I figured it was just a deer, or maybe a coyote. The river was a source of fresh water and drew all sorts of wildlife in. It was strange, though. I watched a couple of gray squirrels on shore flee into the woods, and then I noticed the birds had left too. It was like everything alive was suddenly given notice to steer clear of the shoreline. Everything except me. I was thinking that maybe I should turn back. Maybe it had been enough fishing for the day. I'm not often easily spooked, but I felt unsafe out there in that boat. There was a brief moment of silence before something broke the surface of the water. Something big. In the blink of an eye, huge ripples rolled out across the river. Something was splashing and thrashing wildly just beneath the surface. My boat was rocking, and I quickly moved to stable myself. This wasn't right. The thing beneath the water was circling my boat, and I could see the size of it. At first, I thought it was a gator, but the shape was wrong. No, this was something else entirely, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it was. Grabbing the oars, I started to row as fast as I could. I never really got a good look at what was in the water that day. I was too busy trying to get the hell out of there. But I did glance back once, and what I saw will stick with me forever. There were eyes, large and piercingly yellow, watching me from the water. That moment felt like it stretched on forever, and then it was gone, submerged beneath the surface once more. It was an experience that shook me to the bone, but I managed to reach the shore without any incident. I stayed off the water for about a month after that. I told myself it must have been a large gator. Nothing strange or supernatural about it. Monsters didn't exist, and if they did, what are the odds that I would run into one? I'm nobody special. So I went back out to the river. I stayed on shore this time. I wasn't ready to get back in the boat, but I was itching to hook a fish, even a small one. It was a pretty quiet morning. I had my usual setup and my container of crawlers. Normally, I would have caught a thing or two by now, but it's called fishing, not catching. So I leaned back on a tree along the shoreline and closed my eyes and listened to the calming waves lap against the bank. Not a moment later, I felt a tug. Whatever was on the end of my line was big. I set the hook and I shouldered my rod to get control of it. Whatever was on the other end was strong, terrifyingly so. It took everything I had, all my strength and experience, just to keep hold of the pole. My heart hammered against my chest, adrenaline fueling my every move as the thrill I'd been seeking surpassed anything I'd signed up for that day. I was afraid the rod would break or the line would break, or both, for that matter. I was sure I had a gator on the end of my line. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, I dragged the creature up onto the bank, breathless and aching. And then I froze. What I was looking at was something straight out of a prehistoric nightmare. It was at least 6 or 7 feet long. It rose up out of the water and stood on its hind legs like a man. The beast was covered in scales and had a distinctly lizard-like head, but it had fins too, and what looked like gills along its neck. It seemed capable of breathing both above water and below it. It turned to me slowly, still hung up on my fishing line. I recognized the eyes. This was the creature I encountered on my last fishing adventure. I took out my pocket knife, cutting the line that was connecting me to the monster. It almost seemed surprised as the tension went slack, and then, without missing a beat, it turned and disappeared again into the water. I remember standing there, shaking, realizing how lucky I was to have made it out of that situation alive. After that encounter, the world looked different to me. I almost wish I didn't know about it. I know there are more people out there who have seen these things that keep quiet about them for fear of sounding insane. But they are real and they're out there, whether we want to admit it or not.